In this video lecture, we will look into another organ of GI tract, stomach. Right? You can see in these diagrams that stomach is a J-shaped organ. Right? Stomach is clearly a J-shaped organ. Just as this is how J looks like. Right? You can see it's somewhat a J-shaped organ. And if we talk about its position, right, anatomic position, then we need to look at this diagram. Right, here is your stomach, right, and anatomist, to locate organs in your abdominopelvic cavity, they have divided stomach or abdominopelvic cavity into different regions so as to locate different organs of the abdominopelvic cavity. Right, you have, this is your epigastric region, this is your umbilical region, right, and this is your left hypochondriac region. Right, so your stomach is in the epigastric, umbilical, and left hypochondriac regions of the stomach. Right, and if you look at the previous diagram, stomach is kind of a connector between your esophagus and your first part of small intestine, which is your duodenum. You can see here is your esophagus coming. Right, then all of a sudden this is a J-shaped enlargement. Right, then you have your duodenum. Right, so basically this J-shaped enlargement, which is your stomach, is connecting esophagus with your duodenum. Right, so it's kind of a connector between esophagus and duodenum. And one important thing is that it's very important thing about stomach is that it acts as a holding reservoir and a mixing chamber for the bolus that it receives from the from the esophagus. Right, when food is in the esophagus, we call it a bolus. Right, when through gastroesophageal sphincter, we have talked in the previous lecture that here somewhere we have a sphincter, a circular muscle that guards the movement of food from your esophagus into your stomach. Right, so when your food comes into stomach, right, stomach mixes food with the gastric juice, right, that it secretes from various gastric glands. We'll talk about the gastric glands in a moment. Right, so when it mixes up food, right, or the bolus with the gastric juice, it converts your bolus into liquid, which we call as chyme. Right, and we know that with the speed with which we eat food, right, is very high. Right, or the speed with which we eat food is not same as the speed with which different organs can digest and absorb food. Right, so what this stomach does is it will hold food for some time. Right, it can hold food for around 2 to 3 hours. Right, and it mixes up the food. Right, when it mixes up food, it changes your bolus into your chyme. And we know that peristalsis, we've studied this, gone through peristalsis in previous lecture. Peristalsis is the contraction of the muscles of the stomach or of the entire GI tract. Peristalsis takes place in the entire GI tract, but is very strong in your esophagus part and is weak in, comparatively, it's weak in stomach. So when walls of the stomach will contract, it will move that chyme slowly into the duodenum, where maximum digestion takes place. Right, so in stomach, less digestion takes place. In your duodenum, maximum digestion takes place. In very less digestion takes place in stomach. Right, and in stomach, the early digestion of proteins and triglyceride occurs. Right, because your gastric juice has proteases and gastric lipase. Proteases digest proteins, right, and your lipase will digest triglycerides or lipids. Right, so when the proteins is in stomach, say, like I said, its early digestion starts. So proteins will change into peptones and your polynucleotides, right? And because it will not be completely broken down into your amino acids, right? So further digestion of these proteins will take place in duodenum, right? When food will move in duodenum, we know that duodenum has various juices, right? It has various enzymes that will help digestion, completely digesting the proteins that it receives from stomach, right? So I hope this is clear. So the important thing about stomach is it acts as a mixing chamber, right? It acts as a mixing chamber and a holding reservoir. Holding reservoir, because it can hold food, right? It acts as a holding reservoir. Now, and also I forget to mention, digestion of starch also continues in the stomach, right? And your semi-solid bolus is converted into liquid, right? And only some substances are absorbed. So I'll just mention it over here. Your semi-solid bolus will change into liquid chyme, right? Due to the action of gastric juice. And since the stomach acts as a mixing chamber also. Right, now let's look into the anatomy of the stomach. The stomach is concentrate on this diagram. The stomach has four main regions: the cardiac, right? This is the cardia, right? And the other is fundus, right? Then you have body, right? And then you have pylorus. This part is your pylorus, right? The cardia surrounds. This is the cardia, right? This is the cardia, which surrounds the superior opening of the stomach, with the esophagus, right? So cardia surrounds the superior opening of the stomach, right? And this is kind of a rounded portion, right? And the rounded portion superior to and to the left of the cardia, it's superior, it's above cardia, and to the left of the cardia, right, is your fundus. And below fundus, inferior to the fundus, is the large central portion of the stomach called the body. This is the body of the stomach, right? And the region of the stomach that connects to the duodenum, right? We know that stomach connects to the duodenum. The region of the stomach, right, that connects to the duodenum, we call it as pylorus. And pylorus has two parts: pyloric antrum, which is connected to the main body of the stomach, and the other is pyloric canal, right? This is somewhere here. You can look at this, the other diagram in the middle, right? This one. This is your pyloric canal, which leads into your duodenum, right? And between stomach and your duodenum, you have pyloric sphincter, right? And between esophagus and stomach, you have gastroesophageal sphincter. So there are some abnormalities associated with these sphincters, right? We call it as diseases, right? Let's talk first about pyloric sphincter, right? With pyloric sphincter, there are two conditions associated mostly with infants, right? The first condition, we call it as pylorospasm. In pylorospasm, the sphincter, right, the sphincter muscles doesn't get relaxed when food moves from stomach to your duodenum, right? So when the muscles of the sphincter doesn't get relaxed, that means there is problem for food passing into the duodenum, right? Because it is your sphincter, the pyloric sphincter, that relaxes and will allow the movement of food from stomach to your duodenum, right? So when the food will not move into the duodenum and will keep entering into stomach from esophagus, what happens is your stomach will become full. It will become over full, right? And due to this, if an infant is is having milk, right? So he would not be able to pass, the infant would not be able to pass milk into duodenum, into the next section, and your stomach will become full of milk, right? So what happens is you will observe that an infant with this condition will often vomit the milk, right? So when there is any complaint that an infant is vomiting milk, right, you can suspect of pylorospasm. And this condition can be treated with medicines. Medicines can relax these muscles to allow milk into the duodenum, right? Then the other condition you have is your pyloric stenosis. In pyloric stenosis, the pyloric sphincter is narrowed down, right? This opening, the pyloric stenosis is a narrowing of pyloric sphincter, right? This is a different condition than pylorospasm. Here, the opening will become narrow. The sphincter will become narrow, which again will make problems, right, for the infant to pass milk from stomach into the duodenum. In this condition, again, they would be vomiting, but here there is a symptom, right, that the vomit will go to a little more distance from the infant. We call it as projectile vomiting, right? The spraying of liquid vomitus some distance from the infant, right? Projectile vomiting, right? So it's a symptom of pyloric stenosis. And pyloric stenosis cannot be treated via medicines, right? It cannot be treated with medicines. It has to be corrected surgically, right? And when the stomach, the third diagram that you see here is when the stomach is empty, right? When the stomach is empty, you can see these wrinkles kind of things, right? Which we call as gastric rugae, right? For the first time, we have heard the term rugae when we studied palatine rugae, right? The palate, the roof of the oral cavity have these rugae, right? Which are called as palatine rugae, right? And we call these as, these are also rugae, right, inside your stomach. When the stomach is empty, the mucosa lies in large folds. You can see these looks kind of folds, right? It lies in large folds, which are called as rugae, and rugae meaning wrinkles, right? And these rugae can be easily seen with unaided eye. You don't need any device to look at these rugaes. And the pylorus, we have already done this. That pylorus communicates with the duodenum through your pyloric sphincter. And we have gone through two conditions of the pyloric sphincter as well. And there is one condition which is associated with gastroesophageal sphincter, which is between your esophagus and your stomach. Sometimes your gastroesophageal sphincter will go weak, due to which there is backward movement of food into your esophagus, right? The work of the sphincters is to allow only onward movement, forward movement of food. It should not be allowing the backward movement of food. If there is backward movement of food, that means there is some issue, right? Or a disease. We call it as gastroesophageal reflux disease, right? Or simply acid reflux. Why we call it as acid reflux? Because we know that our stomach has acid. It has HCl, right? So when the contents of the stomach will back up or reflux in your esophagus, it has acid. So when the acid will go into your esophagus, and your esophagus is, if you remember the anatomy of esophagus, behind the esophagus you have the esophagus is behind the heart, right? So it will cause it will cause burning sensation near the heart, right? Which is not any issue with your heart, not any cardiac problem, but it's a problem with your sphincter, right? It's a acid reflux or gastroesophageal reflux disease, right? Due to which we feel burning sensation because of the acid that is getting backed up into the esophagus. That acid causes the burning sensation. Right, now let's quickly talk about the histology, the tissue study of the stomach. We have already gone through the 4 layers of the stomach, of our gastrointestinal tract, right? So stomach also has the same 4 basic layers with little modifications. The surface of the mucosa layer, right, is a layer of simple columnar epithelial cells called surface mucous cells, right? And the mucosa contains a lamina propria, which is again a areolar connective tissue, and a muscularis mucosae. Epithelial cells extend down into the lamina propria, where they form columns of secretory cells. Remember, they form columns of secretory cells called gastric glands. We know that gastric glands secretes, right, various chemicals and enzymes into the lumen of the stomach, right? And it is due to these secretory cells that gastric glands secrete enzymes and other chemicals, right? So these gastric glands that lie many narrow channels called gastric pits, right? Secretions from several gastric glands flow into each of the gastric pit and then finally into the lumen of the stomach, right? And the important thing is that the gastric gland contains 3 types of exocrine gland cells. The first is mucous cells, right? Then is your chief cells, then is your parietal cells, right? Then your mucous neck cells, let me just take it down over here. Your mucous cells will secrete mucus, right? Then you have chief cells that secrete pepsinogen and your gastric lipase, right? It's your, we call it as chief cells, right? And chief cells will secrete pepsinogen. Pepsinogen and gastric lipase. Pepsinogen is an inactive form of pepsin. So inside stomach, when pepsinogen comes in contact with hydrochloric acid, it will become active, and we call it as pepsin. So pepsin is the active form of pepsinogen, right? And pepsinogen gets activated when it mixes up or when it comes in contact with hydrochloric acid, right? And pepsin helps in digesting your proteins, right? So early digestion of proteins starts in stomach, right? Most important things. Early digestion of protein starts in stomach, and they get digested into various peptones and your other polymers of amino acids, right? And it's not these proteins are not completely digest into your amino acids, right? Further digestion of amino acids continues in the next part of your GI tract, which is your duodenum, right? And then is your parietal cells. Parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid, right? Parietal cells will secrete hydrochloric acid and an intrinsic factor, call it as intrinsic factor. Hydrochloric acid, we know, helps in killing bacteria or pathogens that is present in food, and your intrinsic factor will help in absorbing vitamin B12. It helps, or it's needed for the absorption of vitamin B12, right? And in addition to these, gastric glands they also have G cells, right? And G cells secrete hormone called gastrin, right? And this hormone gastrin will stimulates several aspects of gastric activities, right? We'll go through gastric juice and all these G cells and all, how gastric juice is exactly formed in another video lecture. But here, just a little, just an introduction of gastric juice, right? And most important thing is gastric juice will mixes up, or your stomach mixes, since it's a mixer, so it mixes the bolus or the food with gastric juice and will change it into liquid. We call it as chyme, right? And slowly your stomach will move or will squeeze chyme into your duodenum, right, where maximum digestion takes place, right? And because the speed with which we eat meal, right, with the same speed the food doesn't get absorbed and digested, right? So food acts as a holding reservoir, like we discussed before, right? So I hope this is clear. In the next video lecture we would be talking more about chemical digestion in the stomach and your gastric juice. I hope this is clear to you. Thanks.